Hello, welcome to this video where we'll be looking at the new operations module found within the Hector application. But more specifically, we'll be taking a look at the purchase order section and how this can bring value to your organization. I'm Joey Montambeau and we'll be spending the next 20 minutes together taking a look at all the in-depth features of this section. Well, let's begin. The first thing you need to know within this new operations module is that it brings a new section to the menu at the top. The first thing you'll notice is there's an operations section containing both the purchase orders and work orders section. Furthermore, within the resources menu, we now have access to a customers, a vendors, and a contact section. And finally, within the settings, we have access to the operations submenu, which will allow us to toggle some of the configurations for our purchase order module. So let's start there. Within the operations settings section, we can either browse towards the purchase order or the work order. Since this video is for the purchase order, let's remain within this section and take a look at the different settings and configurations that we can adjust per our organization's requirements. The first one is the prefix. You can set a prefix for each of the purchase orders that will be generated by Hector. You can also set a number start. So for example, if you want all your purchase orders to begin with 1, then you will set the number start at 1. But if you would like your range to start at the 10,000, you can put 10,000 here. Of course, this field is locked down once we create our first purchase order. So it's very important to set it at the beginning because afterwards you won't be able to reset it. The next field is the default expiration date. We can set a default expiration time lapse based on the current date for each of the purchase orders that are generated in the system. The next section is the approval. Within Hector, you can require that all purchase orders be approved by a member of your staff. This is not required, but if you do activate this option, then a selected approvers group will be necessary in order to approve the purchase orders that are being generated by your staff. Finally, you can receive notifications for each of the purchase orders. So whether it be a notification for a request for approval, or if the requester receives an approval confirmation or rejection by email. The last section allows you to toggle the different column visibility, the name and the order of each of those columns within the grids that are found throughout the application. Once you've set up the settings per your requirements, the next step you can do is navigate towards the resources section within the vendor screen. As you know, to be able to emit a purchase order, you need a vendor within the application because vendors will allow you to order the equipment or the items or the assets that you're looking for. So we'll come in here and create a new vendor. When you create your first vendor, you'll be asked to fill in some of the information that you're used to filling out. So the name, description, street address, city, fax, phone, email, all this information allows you to better identify your vendor. You can also upload a logo of that vendor to make it more easy to spot them throughout the application. So we'll use an existing vendor within our tests just to show you the capabilities, but you can create as many vendors as you want. There is no limitation. Once you've created a vendor, for example, let's take this vendor as our vendor for the tests today, we can see that we can have access to different information from that vendor, whether it be vendor details, some of the contacts that we'll have created for that vendor, parts that we're used to buying from that vendor, any assets that we might have transferred to that vendor. So not only can you emit purchase orders for this vendor, but you could also, if this vendor is responsible to repair some of the assets in the organization, and you want to make sure that you know exactly where the assets are and they're with that particular vendor, you can assign those assets directly. And finally, of course, we have a section for the purchase orders where all of the purchase orders that we've passed to that vendor throughout time will be found within this section. Finally, the history section contains all the operations we've done with regards to assets for that vendor. So once we've set up our vendors, the next step for us will be to go out and create our first purchase order. So let's go into the purchase order section, take a look at what's in there. First thing we'll see is we kind of have a bar here at the top containing different statuses for our purchase orders. The idea here is that purchase orders have a life cycle similar to an asset. They'll start as a draft, so this is when your staff is preparing the purchase order, putting in the lines, making sure that we have all the information. Once that's done, often the purchase order, if you don't have a requiring of an approval of those purchase orders, that purchase order will be sent to the vendor in order to obtain the equipment or hours or whatever is being ordered from that vendor. Once that purchase order is sent, you can capture an expected reception date. This is really important if you're expecting to receive all the equipment by a certain date, and you want to make sure that you track your late purchase orders in order to either get feedback from the vendors or be able to evaluate the impact on your organization of receiving that equipment a little bit later. Once the equipment or the purchase order has been received, you'll be able to create assets, which is very beneficial directly from that purchase order in the application. You can also indicate that the purchase order has been paid, and finally it can be set to a completed status, and in this status it's considered as being fully delivered, fully paid, and there's no other actions required on that purchase order. Well, let's create our first purchase order, take a look a little bit what it looks like. Well, the first thing we're going to go out and do is pick the vendor that we saw earlier. So in this case, we're going to grab the Leonard vendor, and since I had a primary contact set up for this vendor, it was automatically selected. But I could change the contact should I need to. The next step is who's the owner within my organization of that purchase order. I'm logged in as Bob Stan, so the system automatically set my user as being the owner, but I could change this to another member of the staff within the organization if I wanted to choose somebody else for being the owner of this purchase order. The order date, so the purchase order date, is set automatically to today, and this is the area where I can set an expected reception date so that if the date goes beyond that and I still haven't received the equipment, then I would receive a notification with regards that this purchase order is late. If I want to set an expiration date, this can be very useful communicating this kind of information to the supplier or the vendor. Then I can set this expiration date or leave it blank. It's not a required field. The currency for the vendor automatically chosen by or picked up from the vendor when I created my purchase order. And then if I receive some kind of quote or any kind of reference number from the vendor, I could put it here. Makes it easier to find it in the system once this purchase order has been created. If I have any other documents that I want to add to this purchase order, being it a quote or technical documentation with regards to my purchase order, I can attach it here. If not, I'm ready to create my first line. So of course, a purchase header always has a header and has lines. The idea here is I'm going to start to populate the lines of my purchase order. To do that, I have to choose one of the categories that I've created within the system. So I've created multiple categories, whether it be cameras or any other kind of equipment, and then I get to choose a part that I want to order from that vendor. So I could choose here a Sony camera and select that part. Automatically, Hector notice this is the quantity, this is the price that you have set up on that part, and then if the vendor provided any form of discount, I could enter it here. I could also order multiple quantities, so I could order 2 of those cameras for a unit price of $400 each. I can then save in new in order to create a new line, or I can save and close and go back to my purchase order. In this case, let's do save and new so that I can show you one of the other options that are available when creating a purchase order. Second option here is if I choose none for categories, what will happen? Well, if I choose none, the idea here is I'm able to enter any kind of line on my purchase order. It doesn't have to be a part that already exists within the Hector application. So in this case, I could be ordering hours, I could be ordering repair job from this particular vendor, and I want to make sure that I capture that information. So I could here say repair equipment and then choose the quantity. So the vendor could have quoted me 4 hours, and then I could set a price. So if I say this vendor is charging me $75 an hour, and we're talking about a 4-hour job, then I can save and close and take a look at what my purchase order will look like. So here I have my first line, and we have a direct link to the part that I'm ordering within the system, but I also have a line that's dedicated to the second task, which was to repair the equipment. So I have a $1,100 purchase order in the system ready to be saved. When I save this purchase order, it's going to be saved in the draft status or state. Very important because this allows me to fine-tune and do any other adjustments that might be necessary before I go out and send this purchase order to the vendor. So I have this purchase order here, number 9. We see all the information, the draft status, the price or the total cost on the purchase order. And then if I look at the action menu, I have different actions that I can take. I could send this purchase order manually to the vendor, or I could choose it to send it by Hector directly by email to my vendor. What's important, if I select this option to send the purchase order by email, it's going to be very important that my vendor or my contact on the vendor has an email set up. If there's no valid email, of course, nothing will happen. This button will still put the purchase order in the sent state, but obviously it will not be sent by email. Finally, I could print this directly within the Hector application and take a look at this purchase order. It's basically set up so that I can print and send it directly to my vendor if I needed to. So let's take for granted that we're going to send this purchase order manually. So this purchase now is in the sent state. If I take a look at all my purchase orders that are in the sent state, I have basically 2 right now that are with my vendor here, which is Leonard. I have 1 purchase order that's late, 1 that's been received, 1 that's been paid. The next action for this purchase order is, since I send it out to my vendor, I could either receive the material or simply mark the purchase order as completed, which will move it to the final step. So let's go in and do the receiving of this purchase order to see a little bit what's going to happen. What's pretty cool about the receiving step is that we get to select the quantities that we've received from our vendor, as well as choose the stockroom where the equipment is going to go. So this saves us a lot of time on asset creation, because something that we naturally do, which is track the purchase order with our vendor, we can do that with Hector now, and now we can also directly create our assets from that purchase order. So I can select the quantities I've received, move its stockroom if I want to send the equipment to another area within my organization. I can of course receive the hours, so if there were some hours that were done with regards to the purchase order, I could go in and perform that step as well. So once I'm ready to receive the purchase order, I would simply validate the information that's here and then click on Save. Once I save my purchase order, it's going to be in the received state, which means I've received everything with regards to that purchase order. What's also very interesting is that Hector will have gone out and created those 2 Sony cameras directly within the inventory. So I can take a look at those new assets that have been created from the purchase order. We can see them here. Since I have assets tags to set up to automatically generate numbers, the system has gone out and populated or recommended 2 numbers for those asset tags as well. If I take a look at the asset itself and go to its history, I should be able to see now that this asset was created directly in my library study rooms, but from this specific purchase order. So now I've captured its birth, where it was birthed directly within the history section. If I go back to my purchase orders, so finally let's take a look at the last remaining statuses within the purchase order. So we've seen that we have this purchase order that's been received. So what we could do now is either mark it as paid or basically set it up as having been completed. So either way, the system is going to indicate that that purchase order is in this new state. If I set it as being completed, I've now completed my very first purchase order within the application for my camera and my repair equipment. 2 other things I want to show you just before we end the video. The first is on parts, we can set up vendors. So very important, you can go back and specify directly for certain vendors. So for some cables, for example, we can say which vendor are we buying these cables from, or who's our primary vendor. So because I have access to the purchase order section, I can set up vendors directly for these parts. If I do save and view, we're going to see that now this vendor is going to be set up for this specific part. Another thing and the last thing that I wanted to show that's pretty cool is that we can create a new purchase order directly for this part. So for example, if we were in our parts listing and we were taking a look at our minimum quantity of our stock, we can see that, for example, I have 2 cameras to buy to make sure that I have all my on-hand quantity for my city of Quebec City. I can come in here, click on new purchase order, and Hector is going to automatically select my vendor. I'm going to select the contact from that vendor. It's going to set up the owner and is also going to add a line with the necessary quantities of this equipment or this part, so that my only thing that I have left to do now is basically hit save and send that purchase order off to the vendor. So with one click, I've set up my purchase order to resupply my inventory to make sure I don't miss out on any of the equipment that I need on my day-to-day basis. So that was our video showcasing the new purchase order module found within the Hector application. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I want to make sure that you know that this new module is specifically set up to help organizations with their operation day-to-day, make sure that it makes it easier and easier for them to run their activities. If you have any questions about this module, make sure you reach out to our sales team, send us information. If you want a demonstration of this, we'll be very happy to spend some time with you and go into more in depth about how this module can help your organization. Well, thanks for viewing. Remember to subscribe to this channel so that you get future videos related to Hector. Any new features, anything that comes up, you'll be notified, and you'll be, of course, kept up to date with what's going on. And finally, like this video if you liked this new purchase order section. It helps us definitely to get the application known. So thank you again. Have a great day, and talk to you guys later.